He's a puss. And I kicked the door open with my foot. And I said, you motherfucker. And I start screaming at Piper. I just bear palm, bam. I smack him in the side of the head. He goes down.
There is a man in professional wrestling who has looked at some of the greatest names in the history of this sport and said straight to their faces, or straight to the camera, I hate his guts. That man is Kevin Nash. 7 feet of bad attitude, multiple world titles, and a mouth that has never once stopped running. He is a legend. He is a Hall of Famer. He helped build the New World Order into one of the most iconic factions in wrestling history. He sold out arenas, moved merchandise, and changed the business forever. But underneath all of that greatness, Kevin Nash has spent decades keeping a mental list. A list of wrestlers he looked at and decided did not deserve his respect. 10 names, 10 stories, 10 moments where Big Sexy drew a line and dared someone to cross it.
If you are already feeling the heat on this one, go ahead and hit the hype feature right now and give this video some hype. Because these stories get messy, they get personal, and in more than one case, they get physical. So what makes Nash respect someone at all? That is the real question before we get into the list. Because once you understand how Nash thinks, you start to see why these 10 people ended up where they did. Nash is not someone who respects hard work alone. He respects hard work that makes money. He does not care how many 5-star matches you can put together in a gym in front of 200 people. He cares about whether you can fill a stadium. That is the foundation of everything he believes. Size, star power, mainstream appeal, and the ability to draw paying customers through the door. If you had those things, Nash would shake your hand. If you did not, you were already one step behind in his eyes. This mindset was not formed in a vacuum. It was built inside one of the most powerful backstage groups in wrestling history, The Clique. Nash, Shawn Michaels, Scott Hall, Triple H, and Sean Waltman. These 5 men locked arms in the mid-90s and quietly took over the World Wrestling Federation from the inside out. They protected each other. They decided who got pushed and who got buried. They operated like a business within a business, and they believed without any doubt that the top of the card belonged to people who understood how to draw money and protect the industry. Anyone who challenged that system, anyone who refused to follow the rules of the hierarchy, was putting themselves in Nash's crosshairs. That is the lens you need to wear for this entire video, because every single name on this list violated something in Nash's code. Some were unreliable, some were too small in his eyes, some refused to do what they were told. Some clashed with him on a philosophical level so deep that no amount of conversation was going to fix it. And some made the mistake of publicly disrespecting someone Nash cared about. Each story is different, but the pattern is always the same. Nash decided they did not belong, and then he made sure they knew it. Now, here is something worth keeping in mind as we go through these names. Nash does not always come out of these stories looking like the hero. In fact, most of the time, when you pull the curtain back, you see a man who used his power to punish people, who used his position to keep certain wrestlers down, and who confused gatekeeping with wisdom. He calls it protecting the business. A lot of people who were on the receiving end of it would call it something else entirely. So let us start the countdown, beginning at number 10 and working our way down to the wrestler who drew the most personal fire from Nash of all. Number 10, Paul Heyman. Paul Heyman never laced up a pair of boots as a performer, but Kevin Nash has spoken about him with more contempt than almost anyone who ever stepped in the ring. And that contempt is rooted in something deeper than personal dislike. It is a full clash of philosophies. 2 completely different visions of what professional wrestling is supposed to be. Heyman built Extreme Championship Wrestling on the idea that smaller wrestlers, edgier storytelling, and hardcore violence could capture an audience that the big promotions were ignoring. He gave opportunities to performers who would have been passed over elsewhere. He championed a style of wrestling that valued intensity, realism, and athleticism over size and star power. To millions of fans, he was a visionary. To Kevin Nash, he was a problem. Nash called Heyman's approach amateur. He called it dangerous. He said Heyman was a mark for his own talent, which in wrestling means someone who loses perspective and starts believing in the performance more than the business behind it. Nash's argument was simple and brutal. Heyman convinced wrestlers to take extreme risks, to put their bodies through punishment for very little financial return. He filled small arenas and built passionate followings, but he could not keep the lights on. ECW eventually went bankrupt, The bills could not be paid. And Nash pointed to that outcome as proof that Heyman's entire model was flawed from the start. What Nash said repeatedly was that the only innovation in wrestling that actually matters is the one that fills arenas and increases the money coming through the door. Everything else is art for art's sake. And while art has its place, it does not pay anyone's mortgage. He viewed Heyman as someone more concerned with being cool and edgy than with running a real business.
He saw the ECW fanbase as a cult audience that would never grow into the mainstream. He looked at everything Heyman built and saw a monument to poor financial judgment. Now, there is a real argument to be made that Heyman changed wrestling in ways that still echo today. Countless innovations from ECW were borrowed by the major promotions. Countless careers were launched there. But Nash was not interested in giving credit for influence. He measured success in dollars, and by that measure, he felt completely justified in his dismissal. That coldness, that willingness to reduce human creativity to a profit margin, is one of the clearest windows into how Nash thinks, and it sets the tone for everything that follows. Number 9, low-key. Low-key represents something that genuinely frustrated Kevin Nash about the direction of modern wrestling. Low-key is short. Low-key is stiff. And low-key, in Nash's opinion, had no business being treated as a serious, top-level performer in the professional wrestling world. Let us start with the stiff style. Low-key is known throughout the industry for hitting hard. His strikes are not soft and cooperative. They are sharp, fast, and they land with real force. Many performers who have worked with him over the years have noted that working a match with low-key requires you to be ready to absorb genuine physical contact. Now, some people respect that intensity. To Nash, it was a failure, a fundamental failure of the most basic job description in professional wrestling. If you are in the ring with someone and you are hitting them with real force, you are not protecting your opponent. You are choosing your own style over their safety. That, to Nash, is not toughness. It is selfishness. Then there is the size issue. Nash never tried to hide his belief that smaller wrestlers simply could not draw the kind of money that justified their position at the top of a major card. He placed low-key firmly in that category, describing him as a vanilla midget who took himself far too seriously for someone of his standing in the industry. The vanilla midget label was Nash's shorthand for any technically skilled but physically small wrestler who, in his view, could not generate the mainstream attraction necessary to headline major events. Nash also criticized low-key's approach to selling. In wrestling, selling means convincing the audience that what is happening to you is real. You take a big move, you react like it hurt, you give the match a story. Nash argued that low-key's style made it almost impossible for larger opponents to look credible, because when a giant throws someone across the ring and that someone bounces right back up like nothing happened, the audience stops believing. And once the audience stops believing, the whole thing falls apart. To Nash, low-key was the symbol of a generation that had mistaken seriousness for professionalism and physical intensity for drawing power. He was not shy about saying so. And whether you agree with Nash or not, the fact that he openly dismissed a performer as talented as low-key says a great deal about the very narrow lane in which Nash believed great wrestling was supposed to exist. Number 8. Chris Jericho. If low-key was the symbol, Chris Jericho was the public target. Nash coined the phrase vanilla midgets during his time in WCW, and while he aimed it at the cruiserweight division broadly, Jericho became the face of everything Nash resented about the work rate movement. And unlike some of Nash's targets, Jericho fought back. In WCW, Jericho was performing brilliantly and being rewarded with almost nothing. He was electric on the microphone, technically gifted in the ring, and capable of getting any crowd on their feet. But to Nash and the people who thought like Nash, he was a mid-card act at best. He was not big enough, not imposing enough, and not the kind of attraction that Nash believed could carry a company. It was a belief Nash held so firmly that he was willing to say it in public, and it damaged careers. Years later, in 2012, Nash reignited the fire by claiming that wrestling died on the night of WrestleMania 20. That was the night Chris Benoit and Eddie Guerrero, two of the most gifted technical wrestlers of their generation, closed the show as champions. Nash's argument was that the giants were the attraction, and when the industry shifted away from larger-than-life physical spectacles toward smaller, more relatable athletes, the magic was lost. He was not just criticizing one match or one night. He was dismissing an entire era of wrestling that millions of fans hold as some of the greatest in history. Jericho responded publicly and forcefully. He pushed back on the logic, defending himself and his peers with the kind of sharp, articulate heat that Jericho has always been brilliant at generating. Nash's response was to claim he had been working a puppet master angle the whole time, saying it was all a worked shoot designed to generate interest.
In other words, he claimed none of it was real. But the underlying lack of respect was never truly walked back. The tone was too consistent, the history was too long, and the pattern was too clear. Nash simply did not believe smaller wrestlers belonged at the top of the food chain, and Chris Jericho was the most high-profile name he attached that belief to. What makes this particularly uncomfortable is that Jericho went on to have one of the longest and most celebrated careers in wrestling history. He reinvented himself repeatedly, connected with audiences across generations, and proved the vanilla midget label wrong in the most public way possible. Nash calling that era the death of wrestling, while Jericho was still very much alive and thriving, aged terribly, and Nash knew it. Number 7, Samoa Joe. This one got physical, and that matters because it reveals something about Nash that no amount of podcast commentary ever could. The year was 2007. Kevin Nash was working for TNA, the same company that employed his longtime friend and partner, Scott Hall. Hall was booked to appear at the Turning Point pay-per-view, but he did not show up. Management needed someone to address the crowd. They turned to Samoa Joe, one of TNA's most popular and credible performers at the time, and asked him to deliver a promo acknowledging the situation. Joe did not deliver a simple apology. He went further. He called Hall a punk. He said Hall had let the fans down. He took direct shots at the part-time veterans who were collecting big money, while the dedicated full-time performers were doing the heavy lifting every single week. It was an unscripted moment, raw and honest, and the crowd responded to every word. Nash was standing in the ring during that promo, and Nash did not appreciate a single syllable of it. Backstage, Nash found Joe and asked him directly, "Were those words yours, or did someone script that?" Joe confirmed they were his own. Nash then slapped him across the face, twice. Joe did not hit back. He stood there and absorbed it. Nash walked away feeling like he had enforced the rules of the locker room. Joe apologized to Nash and to the locker room the following day. Now step back and look at what actually happened there. A younger performer called out genuine unprofessionalism from a veteran who had failed his obligations to the fans and to the company. He was honest in a moment that called for honesty, and the response from Nash was to physically humiliate him for it. Not a conversation, not a private pull-aside, a slap in front of people, because Nash had decided that Joe had forgotten his place in the hierarchy. Nash has since framed this as a necessary correction. He and Joe eventually became friendly, and Nash has acknowledged that their relationship improved over time. But the incident itself, the choice to use physical force to silence a younger performer who had said something true, is one of the clearest examples of what the Nash doctrine looks like when it is pushed to its extreme. Respect, in Nash's world, flows one direction, downward, and anyone who disrupts that flow gets corrected. Number 6, Ric Flair. Kevin Nash spent part of his career as the head booker of WCW. That means he was the person deciding the stories, the matches, and the outcomes for one of the 2 biggest wrestling companies in the world. And during that time, he and Ric Flair developed a mutual bitterness that was professional, personal, and very, very loud. Flair was, by any measure, one of the greatest professional wrestlers who ever lived. His career accomplishments were staggering. His in-ring ability was legendary. His charisma was unmatched in almost any era. And Nash, to his credit, acknowledged the weight of that legacy. But acknowledging a legacy and respecting what someone brings to the table right now are 2 different things in Nash's mind. And in the late 90s, Nash did not believe Flair was bringing much to the table at all. Nash criticized Flair's age, his tendency to use political influence to keep himself in the main event scene, and his resistance to the evolution of the product. He viewed Flair as a man who had built his entire identity around being the top guy, and who could not accept that his era of being the top guy was over. From Nash's perspective, holding on to that identity was actively hurting the company because it was taking space that should have gone to fresher acts. The tension between them came to a head repeatedly during Nash's booking tenure. The finger poke of doom, one of the most criticized moments in WCW history, is a good example of the divide. Nash had Hulk Hogan regain the championship by simply poking the already champion Nash in the chest, causing him to drop to the mat. Veterans like Flair viewed it as an insult to the championship and to the art of the business. Nash viewed it as a storytelling device that kept the NWO narrative moving and the ratings competitive. There was also the matter of Flair's real-life legal disputes with Eric Bischoff, which Nash felt were bringing unnecessary chaos and distraction into an already complicated backstage environment. Nash publicly called Flair an old man out of touch with the modern business on more than one occasion, and he did it with a dismissiveness that cut deeper than just a difference of opinion. Nash was not just disagreeing with Flair, he was trying to push him out. The lesson Nash seemed to be teaching here was that past accomplishments do not guarantee present respect. What have you done for the business lately? That was his measuring stick. And by that measure, he had decided Ric Flair was no longer useful. That is a harsh way to treat a legend. But harshness, as we have seen, is not something Nash has ever been reluctant to deliver. Number 5, Roddy Piper. This is where the phrase, "I hate his guts," truly earns its place. Because the Nash and Piper story is the one that got the most physical, the most public, and the most personal of all the locker room confrontations in Nash's career outside of the Samoa Joe incident. Roddy Piper was one of the most beloved and iconic figures in wrestling history. His charisma was infectious, his promo ability was elite, and when he entered WCW in the 90s, he was still a massive name, capable of drawing real interest. But Nash did not see the icon. He saw a man who refused to follow the plan. The incident began during a tag team match on Monday Nitro. The Outsiders, Nash and Scott Hall, were facing Ric Flair and Roddy Piper. The plan was a slow burn match designed to build tension for a pay-per-view that was coming up. Nash wanted to build heat, which means letting the bad guys look dominant over a long enough stretch that the eventual comeback or payoff means something to the crowd. That requires patience and cooperation from everyone in the match. According to Nash, Piper ignored the plan entirely. He came in swinging early, refused to sell Nash's offense, and went into business for himself, which is wrestling's way of saying he abandoned the agreed-upon structure to do whatever felt right to him in the moment. To Nash, that was not just annoying. It was a violation of one of the most sacred rules of the ring. You protect the narrative. You protect each other. You follow the plan. The fallout happened backstage after the match. The accounts of exactly what happened differ significantly between the two men, and they always will. Nash says Piper got in his face, and that when Piper jumped up toward him, Nash open hand smacked him to the floor. Piper, in his own telling, claimed he charged Nash, leg dived him, and threw Nash out of the dressing room. The two versions could not be more different. But most people who were present in that locker room, including figures like Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff, gave accounts that leaned toward Nash's version of events. Piper was said to have been bitter about it for years. Nash described Piper afterward as a deranged old fool whose ego had gotten so large that it overrode his professionalism and the safety of the performers around him. That is a cutting thing to say about a man who gave his body and career to this industry for decades. But Nash said it, and he stood by it. The pattern here mirrors the Flair situation, a legend from a previous era clinging to ways of doing things that Nash had decided no longer had a place in his world. The difference is that with Piper, it did not stay verbal. And that physical element is what cemented this story as one of the most remembered moments of Nash's WCW run. Number 4, Sid Vicious. Here is where Nash's critiques get a little complicated, because Sid Vicious had the one thing Nash says he respects most: size. Sid was enormous, imposing, and had a look that made crowds react the moment he walked through the curtain. By Nash's own stated rules, Sid should have been someone Nash respected, but Nash made exceptions when it suited him, and Sid was one of those exceptions. Nash and Sid worked together extensively in the World Wrestling Federation in 1995. Nash, as Champion Diesel, was supposed to be the centerpiece of the company. Sid was one of his primary opponents. And in Nash's telling, every match they had together was an exercise in frustration, because Sid simply could not remember or execute complex match structures. Nash was critical of what he called Sid's lack of ring IQ. That term means the ability to read a crowd, adjust a match in real time, and construct a series of events inside the ring that tells a coherent story with a beginning, middle, and end. Nash prided himself on being a big man who could actually work, who could carry opponents, pace a match, and build toward a satisfying conclusion. He felt Sid had no interest in developing those skills and relied entirely on his physical presence and intensity to get through matches. Beyond the in-ring issues, there was the reliability problem. Sid was legendary in wrestling circles for leaving promotions suddenly and without much warning. He once famously left the WWF to play softball, not transitioning to another wrestling promotion, softball. To Nash, who approached wrestling as a year-round business commitment, that kind of behavior was almost incomprehensible. You did not walk away from the biggest stage in the world to play a recreational sport. That was not just a career mistake. In Nash's view, it was a sign of someone who did not take the business seriously enough to deserve the spot they had been given. Nash dismissed Sid not with personal hatred, but with professional contempt. He viewed him as a performer who was a mark for himself, meaning someone who believed in their own image so much that they stopped developing real craft. Sid had the look, but not the work. And in Nash's hierarchy, that combination was not enough. Number 3, Jean-Pierre Lafitte, PCO. If you want a perfect case study in how the clique dealt with someone who refused to fall in line, look no further than the story of Jean-Pierre Lafitte, now known as PCO, and what happened in Montreal in 1995. Lafitte was a mid-level performer in the WWF, working a pirate character that had some momentum but was clearly not going to be positioned near the top of the card. He was booked to lose to Nash, who was then champion Diesel, at a house show in Montreal. Montreal was Lafitte's home market, his hometown, and he refused to take the pin. His reasoning was that a clean loss in front of his home crowd would damage his credibility in that market. It was a self-preservation decision, and it led to the match ending in a double countout, which is wrestling's version of a non-finish. Nobody wins, nobody loses cleanly, and the champion does not look dominant. To Nash and the clique, that was unacceptable. The champion was the company. The champion was the business. Refusing to do a job for the champion, especially when instructed to by the office, was not just disrespectful to Nash personally, it was disrespectful to the entire system that kept the WWF running. And the clique had the ear of Vince McMahon and the creative team. What followed was a burial. Lafitte was booked into a series of low-profile, losing matches until his standing in the company was reduced to almost nothing. He eventually left the WWF, and the momentum he had built was gone. Nash viewed it as a consequence Lafitte brought entirely on himself. Lafitte had a mid-card ego in a mid-card role, and when he tried to protect something that was not really his to protect, the machine crushed him for it. What is worth noting here is the sheer coldness of the response. Lafitte made a decision rooted in self-interest, yes, but the punishment handed down was not a conversation or a firm talking to. It was a coordinated effort by a powerful group to end his relevance in the company. That is not discipline. That is dominance for its own sake. And Nash wore it without apology. Number 2, Kerry Von Erich. The Kerry Von Erich story is the one on this list that carries the most sadness. Because unlike some of the others, Kerry's situation was not rooted in ego or defiance. It was rooted in tragedy. By the time Nash encountered Kerry Von Erich in the World Wrestling Federation in the early 90s, Nash was still building his career, working under names like Oz and Vinny Vegas before landing in the WWF. Kerry was already a legend in decline. The former NWA World Champion had suffered a devastating motorcycle accident years earlier that resulted in the amputation of his foot. He wrestled with a prosthetic and managed to hide it from most of the public for years. He was also in the grip of severe drug addiction, which was tearing through the Von Erich family in a way that would eventually claim multiple members of that beloved dynasty. Nash's lack of respect for Kerry was not born from hatred. He did not target Kerry the way he targeted Piper or Lafitte. What Nash expressed was a refusal to acknowledge Kerry as a real peer in his current state. He spoke about Kerry's inability to remember the planned sequence of moves during matches, his lack of focus in the locker room, and the general sense that Kerry was operating at a fraction of what he had once been. Nash called him a liability in the ring, a ghost of a former era, someone whose demons had overtaken his ability to perform his professional duties reliably and safely. And from a pure business standpoint, there is an argument that this assessment was accurate. Kerry was not delivering at the level his spot required. But the way Nash delivered that verdict, without compassion, without much acknowledgement of the extraordinary pain and loss that Kerry had endured, reveals the harshest edge of the Nash doctrine. Kerry Von Erich did not fail because he was lazy or defiant. He failed because he was broken. And Nash's response to that brokenness was to write him off as a professional, as though grief and addiction were simply matters of personal discipline. That coldness is difficult to defend, no matter how sound the business logic behind it might be. Kerry Von Erich died in 1993. He was 33 years old. He left behind a legacy that wrestling fans still honor. And Nash's dismissal of his final working years, while factually grounded in real observations, does not hold up when placed next to the full weight of what Kerry was carrying. Number 1, the Ultimate Warrior. If there is one name that sits at the absolute center of Kevin Nash's list of people he refused to respect, It is the Ultimate Warrior. And the reasons go all the way back to Nash's core beliefs about money, brotherhood, and how a performer is supposed to carry themselves when they reach the top of the industry. The Ultimate Warrior was one of the biggest drawing names in the history of professional wrestling. At his peak, he was arguably the most over performer in the entire WWF. The fans went absolutely insane for him. He was energy, color, intensity, and an explosion of charisma that no one before or since has quite replicated. Nash acknowledged the drawing power. He could not argue with the numbers, but the drawing power, in Nash's view, was all the Warrior had. And once you got past that, what remained was someone Nash could not stand. The money story is the one Nash returns to most often. In 1991, before the SummerSlam main event, the Warrior allegedly held up Vince McMahon for more money. He threatened not to perform unless his financial demands were met. The event was days away. The main event was advertised. McMahon, by most accounts, had no real choice but to agree. Now, here is where Nash's position gets interesting. Nash himself was a famously sharp negotiator. He was a central figure in establishing guaranteed contracts in WCW, which fundamentally changed how wrestlers were paid and protected across the industry. So Nash was not opposed to wrestlers fighting for their money. What he objected to was the method. To Nash, the Warrior's approach was an isolated act of individual selfishness that put the company in crisis mode and endangered the livelihoods of everyone on that show. Nash had worked to raise wages through collective negotiation. The Warrior, in Nash's view, held a gun to the company's head for personal gain and called it business.
Then there was the in-ring issue. Nash was relentless in his criticism of the Warrior's ability to actually perform a wrestling match. He said that the Warrior could not work a traditional match, that every Warrior performance was built on explosive energy and short duration, that there was no craft there, no architecture, no storytelling, just running, screaming, shaking ropes, and getting through things as fast as possible. For Nash, who built his identity around being a big man who could actually construct a match and carry a less skilled opponent to something watchable, this was a genuine professional failing. The Warrior, in Nash's telling, had zero interest in the craft of wrestling beyond what served his own image. He was not a wrestler who happened to have incredible charisma. He was a charismatic figure who did just enough wrestling to avoid being exposed. Nash also described the Warrior's locker room presence as destructive, not in a violent way, but in an isolating way. He portrayed the Warrior as someone so absorbed in his own character, so convinced of his own mythology, that he was essentially unreachable as a coworker. You could not have a real conversation with him about the business, because the business, in the Warrior's mind, existed to serve him. Nash remained critical of the Warrior's legacy even after the Warrior passed away in 2014. That is a heavy thing to do. Most people in the wrestling world softened their public stances when Warrior died, choosing to acknowledge his contributions and leave the grievances alone. Nash acknowledged the drawing ability, but refused to revise his assessment of the man behind the face paint. That consistency, that refusal to speak more kindly of someone just because they were gone, is either admirably honest or staggeringly callous, depending on how you look at it. And how you look at it probably says a lot about how you feel about Kevin Nash in general. So there they are, 10 names, 10 stories, and one through line connecting all of them. Kevin Nash built a world with very specific rules about who deserved to be at the top, and he defended that world with an intensity that sometimes crossed into cruelty. He dismissed people for being too small, too unreliable, too old, too defiant, too different from what he believed a champion should look like. And in more than one case, he backed up that dismissal with something far more direct than words. What you can see, looking at the full picture, is that the Nash doctrine falls into clear categories. There were performers he dismissed for poor ring psychology, like the Warrior and Sid. There were performers he wrote off for unreliability, like Kerry Von Erich, Sid, and the Warrior again. There were performers who defied the hierarchy and paid for it, like Piper, Lafitte, and Joe. There were performers he saw as too small to matter at the top level, like Jericho and Low Ki. And there were figures whose entire philosophy clashed with his own, like Heyman and Flair. Every single name fits into at least one of those categories, sometimes 2 or 3, and Nash knew that staying vocal about all of it kept him relevant. There is no question that his reputation as a straight talker, as a man willing to say what others only think, has extended his public presence well beyond his active in-ring days. Every time he dismisses someone on his podcast or in an interview, his fan base calls it real talk. And maybe some of it is, but some of it is also a performance.
a way of staying in the conversation by being the loudest and most controversial voice in the room. Nash understood that disrespect, when delivered with enough confidence, could be its own kind of brand. The slaps are where the performance ends, though. When Nash slapped Piper, when he slapped Joe twice in a TNA hallway, he was not working a character. He was asserting something. A dominance that he felt entitled to as someone who had earned his place at the top of the card through years of hard work and strategic maneuvering. In the culture of professional wrestling, a slap is the sharpest form of correction available without doing actual harm. It says, "You have forgotten your place, and I am reminding you." That Nash used this tool on multiple occasions tells you that his belief in the hierarchy was not just a philosophical stance. It was something he was willing to enforce in the moment with his hands. But here is what the Nash Doctrine ultimately gets wrong. Respect in wrestling, or in any industry, should be something you extend to people as a starting point, not a reward you hand out only to those who meet your specific requirements of size, reliability, and obedience. The performers Nash dismissed as vanilla midgets went on to build some of the most celebrated careers in wrestling history. The philosophies he called amateur helped reshape an industry. The wrestlers he buried came back. Some of them, like PCO, had full career renaissances long after Nash had written them off for good. Gatekeeping is not wisdom. Deciding who belongs at the top based on a rigid, self-serving set of standards is not protecting the business. It is protecting yourself. And Nash, for all his intelligence and business acumen, spent a significant portion of his career doing exactly that, while calling it something noble. He is a legend. That is real. His contributions to wrestling are undeniable, and his understanding of the business side of the industry is sharper than most performers who came through his era. But the way he exercised that understanding, the way he used his power to diminish people who challenged or irritated him, is not something that should simply be repackaged as straight talk. It caused real harm to real careers and real people. Respect in wrestling should be earned, yes, but it should not be enforced through slaps in hallways and coordinated campaigns to bury mid-card wrestlers in their hometown. It should not be withheld from someone because they are 5'9" instead of 7 feet. And it should not be weaponized to keep a group of powerful men at the top of the food chain while everyone else scrambles for whatever they left behind. That is the real legacy of the Nash Doctrine, not just a list of 10 people he refused to respect, but a system of thinking that told an entire generation of wrestlers that they were not enough, that they did not belong, and that the man holding the door decided who got through. Wrestling is better when the door is open, and the people on this list, in most cases, proved it. Drop a comment below and tell us who you agree with, who you disagree with, and what you think respect in professional wrestling should actually look like. And if you have not already, hit like and subscribe so you never miss a video like this one.
And we bought it for $2 million because nobody saw the potential in it. Vince McMahon, his son wanted to buy the UFC, and his father wouldn't do it. He's like, that's, you know.
Shane McMahon has always been one of the most fearless people to ever step inside a WWE ring. The man jumped off the top of a steel cage. He crashed through glass panels. He bled on pay-per-view stages in front of tens of thousands of screaming fans. He did not have to do any of that. The company already had his last name on it. He could have sat in a boardroom his entire career and nobody would have said a word. But Shane chose the ring, chose the chaos, and chose to earn respect the hard way. For a long time, that counted for a lot. Fans loved him for it. The locker room respected the courage, even when they did not always respect the man behind it. And yet, behind all those highlight reel moments, behind the dives and the drops and the big spots that made arenas explode, there was a version of Shane McMahon the cameras did not always capture. A version that carried deep grudges. A version that started fights, ended careers, and froze out some of the biggest names in wrestling history. This video is called Shane McMahon Exposes 9 WWE Stars He Never Liked. And that thumbnail that reads, "I hate his guts," is not clickbait. These stories are real. They are documented, and they go places that might genuinely surprise you. Buckle in, because the further down this list we go, the more intense it gets. Before we get into the names, there is one thing you need to understand about Shane McMahon, because without it, none of these conflicts make complete sense. Shane was not just a performer moonlighting in a corporate family. He was the eldest son of Vince McMahon, the man who built WWE from a regional wrestling territory into a global entertainment brand. That inheritance came with enormous weight. Shane grew up inside the business, watched it nearly collapse during the Monday Night Wars, and watched his father fight competitors, politicians, steroid investigations, and media scrutiny to keep the company alive. By the time Shane was an adult, his loyalty to that company and to that family name was not just professional, it was biological, it was visceral. It was the kind of loyalty that does not bend easily and does not forgive quickly. He operated inside a unique structural paradox every single day of his working life. On one side, he wanted the validation of the locker room. He wanted wrestlers to see him as someone who bled alongside them and genuinely earned his place among them. On the other side, he felt a deep and non-negotiable obligation to protect the McMahon empire from anyone who threatened it, undermined it, or tried to take advantage of the family that built it. When those two worlds collided with the wrong person at the wrong moment, the results were ugly. And they collided 9 times with 9 names in ways that left permanent marks on the wrestling industry. If this is already getting intense, go ahead and hit the hype feature on this video right now and give it some hype so more wrestling fans can find these stories. It takes 2 seconds and it makes a big difference. We're going in reverse order, starting with the most recent chaos and working back to the conflict that defined Shane's entire trajectory inside WWE. The most recent wound is usually the freshest, so we begin there. Number 9, The Miz. To understand why The Miz ends up on a list about people Shane McMahon never liked, you have to understand the full picture of what happened in the final chapter of Shane's career. The Miz was not the source of Shane's problems. He was the person standing closest when those problems finally came crashing down in the most literal way possible. Most people who watched WrestleMania 39 in April 2023 remember it as a loud, packed, 2-night celebration. Matches, spectacle, fireworks, everything WWE assembles when it wants to remind the world it is still the biggest wrestling company on the planet. What most of those people do not remember is a brief, painful moment during a hosting segment that ended a chapter of wrestling history in the most undignified way possible. Shane McMahon made an unannounced return during a segment involving host The Miz and guest Snoop Dogg. It was supposed to be a short, fun cameo. Something light. Something easy. Instead, within seconds of entering the ring and getting physical with The Miz, Shane completely tore his quad tendon. For anyone who does not know what a quad tendon tear feels like, it is one of the most serious injuries a professional athlete can suffer. The quad is the large muscle group across the front of your thigh that connects down through your knee. When that tendon fully tears, the leg simply stops working the way it should. Shane collapsed in visible pain. Suddenly, The Miz and Snoop Dogg were standing on live television in front of a capacity crowd with no script, no backup, and no plan. Snoop Dogg stepped up and improvised an entire match on the spot. He hit a rock bottom. He hit a people's elbow. He pinned The Miz and salvaged a segment that could have been a complete on-air disaster. Shane was helped out of the ring and the show moved on. But the injury was the end. That torn quad was the final period at the end of Shane McMahon's in-ring career. Here's the part the highlight clips always leave out though. The reason Shane was even in that ring at WrestleMania 39 was because of something that had happened more than a year earlier. Something so damaging to his standing inside WWE that it effectively ended his full-time association with the company before the injury ever occurred. That event was the 2022 Royal Rumble. What happened backstage there set off a chain reaction that nobody inside WWE was fully prepared for. The Miz connection runs directly through that fallout. Shane returned for what was supposed to be a low-key cameo and turned it into a physical spot that destroyed his leg. Vince McMahon had already made it clear internally that Shane would not be given another significant spotlight. The WrestleMania 39 appearance was meant to be brief, harmless, and nostalgic. It became the defining final image of Shane's in-ring life. Number 8, Randy Orton. The 2022 Royal Rumble backstage story involves more than one name, and Randy Orton sits at the center of one of the most embarrassing, specific moments from that entire event. Shane McMahon was not just competing inside the Royal Rumble match that year. He was also co-producing it alongside Abyss, Jamie Noble, Sean Devari, and Adam Pearce. A combination of roles, serving simultaneously as both a producer shaping the match and a competitor performing inside it, created an enormous and obvious conflict of interest that the locker room saw immediately. Shane used his producer access to push aggressively for himself at every turn. He wanted to enter the match at number 1, which would have given him maximum screen time and allowed him to last through most of the 30-man contest. He pushed for moments that would showcase him as a dominant force, standing above the active, full-time roster of performers who worked every single week on television and at live events across the country. The veterans in that locker room were not just frustrated, they were openly hostile toward the entire situation. Randy Orton was one of the loudest and most visible in expressing that frustration. Orton is a 13-time world champion and one of the most respected locker room presences in the history of the company. He does not quietly tolerate disorganization or disrespect. What happens next became one of the most genuinely embarrassing production moments in recent Royal Rumble history. During the chaotic planning process, Shane's entry number and Randy Orton's entry number were accidentally swapped in the paperwork. Shane was supposed to enter at 28 and Orton at 29. The error was caught and Orton was told he would be walking out to Shane McMahon's theme music. He refused, flatly and completely. He reportedly fell to the floor laughing at the sheer level of disorganization. Vince McMahon stepped in personally and rejected most of Shane's self-serving booking requests, slotting him into number 28. Damage to Shane's credibility with the roster was done. Orton's public dismissal of the situation sent a message upward to Vince that the backstage environment around Shane had reached a breaking point. Vince acted on it. And the consequences of that decision contributed to why Shane's WrestleMania 39 return was quiet, brief, and ultimately tragic. Number 7. Brock Lesnar. Brock Lesnar appears twice in the Shane McMahon story, which alone tells you something about the energy Shane spent colliding with him. The first and most intense collision happened at WrestleMania 34 in 2018, in a moment that nearly turned into one of the most dangerous physical confrontations in WWE backstage history. Brock Lesnar had just retained the Universal Championship in a brutal and bloody main event against Roman Reigns. The match was physically intense, and blood was visible on Reigns during the contest. Outcome was kept so tightly secret that even the match referee reportedly did not know Lesnar was retaining until it happened live in front of him. When Lesnar walked back through the gorilla position after the match, he was in a visibly agitated and angry state. Gorilla position is the staging area directly behind the entrance curtain, where talent, producers, and family members gather to watch matches and communicate with the ring. A high-pressure space under the best circumstances. Lesnar, flanked by his manager Paul Heyman, threw the Universal Championship belt directly at Vince McMahon. The belt landed in front of Vince and came dangerously close to striking producer Brian James, better known to fans as Road Dogg. McMahon was standing in the gorilla position and witnessed the entire thing happen in real time. Shane interpreted Lesnar throwing the belt at his father not as a frustrated athlete venting, but as a deliberate act of profound disrespect toward Vince personally and toward the championship itself. Shane stepped forward and squared up to fight Brock Lesnar. He was not posturing. He was actively preparing to initiate a physical confrontation with a former UFC heavyweight champion who outweighed him and had given nobody any reason to believe he would hesitate to hurt someone. The dog grabbed Shane and pulled him backward, telling him directly to let it go. Shane backs down. Lesnar signed a contract extension the very next day, and the incident was quickly downplayed publicly. But what the incident revealed about Shane was lasting and important. The protective reflex that sent him toward Lesnar on behalf of his father was the same reflex that shaped nearly every conflict on this list. It was not calculated. It was not strategic. It was instinctive, immediate, and deeply personal every single time. Shane did not think through the consequences before stepping toward Brock Lesnar. He simply reacted to disrespect, the way a son reacts when someone throws something at his father in a room full of people. Second Lesnar connection at the 2022 Royal Rumble added more heat. Lesnar was frustrated with the chaotic production environment Shane's interference had created. The original plan for the match had Big E winning and carrying momentum forward. That plan dissolved when Lesnar entered as a surprise and refused to follow the established booking. Shane's producer chaos had poisoned the environment badly enough that the planned finish could not hold. Number 6. Eric Bischoff. To understand Shane McMahon's hostility toward Eric Bischoff, you have to go back to what the Monday Night Wars actually meant to the McMahon family. In the late 1990s, WWE and WCW were locked in a primetime television ratings war that nearly ended everything Vince McMahon had spent his career building. WCW was run by Eric Bischoff, who spent years aggressively poaching WWE's top talent with larger contracts, launching competing programming directly against WWE's time slots, and openly declaring his intention to put Vince McMahon out of business entirely. This is not casual corporate competition. WCW at its peak was a genuine existential threat to WWE's survival. The McMahon family watched it happen from the inside, and the stress and fear of that period left marks that did not simply disappear when WCW finally folded in 2001. When Vince signed Bischoff to become the on-screen general manager of Raw in 2002, Vince framed it as a promotional victory, bringing the man who tried to destroy him onto his own television show under his control. Shane McMahon did not share his father's ability to compartmentalize the past for the sake of business. To Shane, Bischoff was not a repackaged executive with useful media experience. Bischoff was the man who had spent years trying to bankrupt his family's company and destroy the brand Shane had grown up inside. Bischoff arrived at WWE. Shane's reception was exceptionally cold. Stage interactions remained distant, guarded, and unwelcoming throughout Bischoff's entire tenure. Shane maintained a deliberate freeze that Bischoff could not penetrate, regardless of what Vince McMahon wanted the internal culture to look like. This was not the fiery, physical type of conflict that produces dramatic stories. It was something quieter, and in many ways more cutting. Shane simply froze Bischoff out entirely, reinforcing by his behavior alone that some debts from the Monday Night Wars were not going to be forgiven, regardless of what the corporate decision-makers decided. Bischoff had used every tool available to him during the war. He signed WWE's top performers away with bigger money. He launched a competing show, Nitro, directly against WWE's Monday Night Raw. He spoiled WWE pay-per-view match results on live television to drive fans away from ordering them. He bragged publicly about his intentions, and he came closer than anyone before or since to actually finishing the job. He never forgot any of it. One move, not one spoiler, not one signed contract. Shane, walking into the same building as Eric Bischoff every week and being expected to act professionally, was an insult dressed up as a business decision. 5. CM Punk. The conflict between CM Punk and Shane McMahon was not built on one incident or one heated backstage moment. It was built on two completely incompatible worldviews that could never be reconciled inside the same organization. Punk was one of the most outspoken and confrontational critics of WWE's corporate culture during his time with the company. He did not keep his opinions private. He made them public, repeatedly and emphatically. Punk directly characterized the McMahon family's management approach as relying on bullying and psychological manipulation to maintain control over the people who worked for them. He explicitly named the McMahon family as some of the biggest bullies he had encountered in his professional career. That is not a vague, abstract critique. That is a direct, personal accusation against the people whose name is literally on the building. Shane's perspective, Punk was an unmanageable contractor who fundamentally refused to show professional deference to the family that had built the industry he was performing in. Shane came from a world where hierarchy was real and authority was respected because the cost of building something from nothing was understood. Punk came from a world where authority needed to be earned differently than by inheriting a last name. Two approaches created a deep mutual skepticism that never produced any meaningful professional connection between the two men. The distance was maintained through the entirety of Punk's WWE run and long after. When Punk eventually departed and wrestling media began speculating about crossover matches, Shane mentioned to a contact at AEW that a match between the two would be wild. The comment circulated quickly and was inflated far beyond what it was, but it revealed something honest. Even years after they had gone separate ways, the fascination with their unresolved, volatile dynamic had not fully faded. Punk's public accusations had real reach. They were heard by fans, repeated in media, and absorbed by other performers with their own quiet frustrations. For Shane, that kind of public airing was exactly the type of reputational damage to the family brand he had spent his career trying to prevent. Punk did not just challenge Shane's authority. He challenged the legitimacy of everything Shane believed made the McMahon family's place at the top of the industry earned and deserved. Punk's position was that the McMahons ruled through fear rather than respect, through leverage rather than merit. Shane's entire professional identity was built on the belief that the McMahon family had earned their position through sacrifice, vision, and years of brutal competitive work. Those two beliefs could not both be true at the same time. That is what made their conflict so total and so permanent. Number 4. Shawn Michaels. Shawn Michaels was the most politically powerful active performer inside WWE during the late 1990s, and the institutional disruption that came with that power was extraordinary. He had direct access to Vince McMahon. He had creative influence that extended far beyond what most performers could reasonably expect. He refused to lose matches when the decision did not suit him, as famously demonstrated during the Montreal Screwjob controversy involving Bret Hart.
He was the anchor of a tight-knit, politically connected group known as the Clique, whose collective influence over WWE decisions bred deep resentment throughout the locker room. Bret Hart publicly alleged that Vince McMahon and Shawn Michaels were romantically involved, a claim dismissed as false by Jim Ross and Kevin Nash. But the fact that such an allegation circulated openly and widely reflected just how abnormal the favoritism Michaels received had become in the eyes of people inside the company. Shane McMahon was, during this same period, actively pushing to impose a disciplined, standardized corporate structure on WWE's daily operations. He believed in a fundamental separation between the people who performed and the people who managed. He called this the division between church and state. Performers performed, executives governed. Those two spheres were not supposed to blur together.
Shawn Michaels was blurring those lines constantly and flagrantly, and he largely got away with it because of how close he sat to the top. Shane viewed Michaels and his associates as a genuine structural threat to the organizational order he was trying to build, not just a difficult personality, a threat to the very framework Shane believed the company needed to survive long term. That produced a quiet, sustained, long-running friction that never exploded in public, but shaped the environment inside WWE for years. The locker room operated under rules that applied to everyone except the people with enough political proximity to Vince to ignore them. Shane saw that double standard every day. He believed that kind of inequality inside the workforce was exactly what led to resentment, rebellion, and the culture problems that made managing the locker room so difficult. Michaels was the most visible symbol of that problem.
And because Vince was not willing to address it directly, Shane was forced to watch the organization he cared about continue operating in ways he found professionally unacceptable. The friction between them was never going to be resolved as long as Vince McMahon remained more personally connected to Shawn Michaels than to the corporate standards Shane was trying to build. Number 3, Buff Bagwell. Buff Bagwell sits at number 3 not because his name carries the weight of a legend, but because the damage his behavior caused to Shane McMahon's most ambitious executive project was catastrophic and irreversible. When WWE purchased WCW in March 2001, Shane was given the on-screen role of WCW's new owner and had advocated internally for running WCW as a fully autonomous television brand, separate from WWE's main programming. He had genuine executive investment in the idea and wanted to prove it could work. To test whether a WCW product could generate audience interest under WWE's banner, the company booked a WCW World Heavyweight Championship match between Booker T and Buff Bagwell as the main event of the July 2, 2001 episode of Raw is War in Tacoma, Washington. Booker T was a credible and respected performer. Bagwell was supposed to provide the credible opposition. Instead, Bagwell had arrived carrying so much backstage heat that the match was effectively doomed before the opening bell. He and Lex Luger had been openly cocky backstage at the final WCW Nitro, telling people they had guaranteed WWE contracts regardless of what happened next. Before the Raw match, Bagwell had been in a physical altercation with Shane Helms, reportedly faked injuries to avoid a spot involving the APA tag team, and most infamously, his mother had called WWE management directly to request time off on her adult son's behalf. When the match aired, the crowd in Tacoma was completely apathetic and hostile. Critics destroyed the match in their reviews. The performance killed any remaining audience appetite for WCW as a standalone concept under WWE. Rip also indicated Bagwell was physically confronted backstage by Bradshaw and Bob Holly. WWE abandoned the WCW revival entirely and pivoted to the broader invasion storyline instead. For Shane, every piece of this represented Buff Bagwell personally sabotaging something he had built real corporate ambition around. When Bagwell showed up at TV tapings the following week, he was fired immediately. The termination was instant and final. No lengthy review, no second chance. Shane's executive project had collapsed, and the person most visibly responsible for the collapse was removed within days. The WCW revival,
The one idea Shane had genuinely built executive ambition around was dead before it ever had a real chance.
Number 2, Jeff Jarrett. October 1999 is one of the most discussed months in WWE backstage history, and Jeff Jarrett put it there. Jarrett was the Intercontinental Champion heading into the No Mercy pay-per-view on October 17, 1999 at the Gund Arena. He was booked to lose the title to Chyna in a specialty match called the Good Housekeeping match, a significant and high-profile moment for Chyna's career. The complication was that Jarrett's WWE contract expired on October 16th, the day before the event. Jarrett recognized the leverage that timing gave him and used it without hesitation. He threatened to take the physical Intercontinental Championship belt with him to WCW if WWE did not pay him a large sum of money. The reported figure was up to $300,000. Vince McMahon, unwilling to risk the continuity and prestige of the Intercontinental Championship, agreed to the payment. Chyna won the match exactly as planned, pinning Jarrett after hitting him with his own guitar. The in-ring portion went off without incidents. Backstage was a completely different story. Shane McMahon was furious. He did not view what Jarrett had done as smart negotiating. He viewed it as direct financial extortion of his father. Shane became loud and aggressive backstage, cursing Jarrett out in front of everyone nearby. According to Hardcore Holly, who witnessed the aftermath, Shane wanted to physically fight Jarrett, and the two had to be separated before anything could escalate. Jarrett collected his money and left for WCW. But the McMahon family's response was not simply to move on. Jarrett was blacklisted from WWE, an institutional banishment driven substantially by the personal resentment the family carried from that evening. It lasted nearly 2 decades. He was eventually welcomed back years later under very different circumstances, but the length of that gap tells you exactly how seriously the family took what happened that night in Cleveland. Shane's anger was not just personal. It was the enforcement arm of a corporate zero-tolerance policy on financial leverage, and Jarrett felt its full weight for almost 20 years. Randy Savage. Before we reach the biggest conflict of all, one more name demands to be included, and it is one of the stranger and more disturbing stories in this entire video. Randy Savage, the Macho Man, was one of the most beloved and celebrated performers in WWE history. He left the company in the mid-1990s under circumstances that were never fully explained publicly. What followed was one of the most complete and sustained institutional exiles in wrestling history. Savage went years without being acknowledged by WWE in any meaningful way. No invitations, no television tributes, no Hall of Fame induction while he was alive. For a performer of his stature, the silence was deafening. Urban legends circulated for years about the specific reason. The most persistent one involved a claim that Savage had a personal relationship with Stephanie McMahon in 1994 when she was 18 years old. Whether that specific claim was fully accurate or not, what is documented is Shane McMahon's personal and physical reaction to Randy Savage's name and image. Brian Solomon, a writer who worked for WWE Magazine, witnessed an incident that speaks louder than any rumor. Shane walked into the WWE Magazine offices, spotted a promotional poster of Randy Savage on the wall, walked directly over to it, and aggressively poked it until it tore free from the wall and dropped to the floor. Then, he stepped on it repeatedly before walking away without any elaborate explanation. He destroyed the poster and left. No speech, no lengthy confrontation, just a physical expression of something deeply personal that he had no interest in explaining to the people nearby. The people who enforced his absence the longest were the people who never forgave whatever they believed had happened. Shane's reaction to that poster suggests he was firmly among them. The full truth of the Savage exile may never be completely public, but the image of Shane McMahon stomping on that poster in a magazine office is documented, witnessed, and telling in a way that no official statement can fully erase. Number 1, Triple H. Everything on this list, every grudge, every confrontation, every banishment and cold shoulder, orbits around the conflict that defined Shane McMahon's entire trajectory inside WWE. No relationship on this list was more personal, more sustained across more years, or more consequential in its ultimate outcome than the one between Shane and his brother-in-law, Paul Levesque,
the man the world knows as Triple H. This friction did not begin with a business disagreement or a power struggle over creative direction. It began with a romantic relationship that Shane was excluded from knowing about until it was already real. When Triple H began dating Stephanie McMahon, Shane's younger sister, Shane was not told while the relationship was developing. Stephanie kept the real-life romance hidden from him during its early stages. When Shane discovered the truth, he felt deceived by his own sister in a world where trust inside the McMahon circle was carefully maintained. The ECW brand eventually launched under a different model that Shane had no real control over. One by one, Shane's ideas were either rejected or absorbed into a framework that did not reflect his original vision for them. The corporate Cold War ended with Shane's sudden resignation in 2009. He did not leave because he wanted to. He had been politically cornered inside a company that carried his own last name. The succession had been decided, and it had been decided against him. When Shane returned in 2016, the terms were completely different. He came back as a talent-only contractor, not as an executive with corporate power. The boardroom was no longer accessible to him in the same way. The shift had become permanent. During a televised 2016 interview, Mick Foley asked Shane directly what his relationship with Triple H was like. Shane gave an answer so carefully evasive that Foley himself described it that way afterward. Shane said only that he was happy his brother-in-law made Stephanie happy. No acknowledgement of Triple H's accomplishments. No warmth. No credit for anything Triple H had built inside the same company Shane grew up in. It was a politician's non-answer, constructed specifically to avoid saying what was clearly still felt. Triple H went on to become Chief Content Officer of WWE, following the company's sale to TKO Group Holdings under Endeavor. The centralized model Shane had spent years fighting against became the official, permanent institutional structure of the organization. The man who married into the family ended up running the business. The biological heir who fought to protect it was gone. Here is where the story ends, and this part matters too. Shane McMahon was not simply a cautionary tale. He was not just a collection of feuds and grievances. He genuinely loved professional wrestling enough to destroy his body for it. And that love was real. The ideas he pushed for were not all wrong. The UFC argument has been fully vindicated by history. The UFC eventually sold for over $4 billion. WWE could have owned a significant portion of that. The WCW independent brand vision was never properly tested because the talent brought in to represent it failed on the very first night. The ECW revival that eventually came had its own energy and audience. Shane's instinct that there was value in running multiple distinct wrestling brands under one corporate umbrella was not wrong. The protective reflex that sent him toward Brock Lesnar in the gorilla position came from a real and deeply human place. Watching someone disrespect your father directly in front of you is not easy to absorb quietly, regardless of how dangerous that person is. Most people would have reacted the same way. Shane just happened to be in a room where reacting the same way could have gotten him seriously hurt. Wrestling survives its drama the way it always has, by giving audiences something to feel. The fans who watched Jeff Jarrett extort the company still got to watch Chyna win that title the very same night and cheered. The fans who never knew about the Lesnar confrontation backstage still experienced one of the most brutal WrestleMania main events ever produced. The corporate war between Shane and Triple H produced compelling television that neither could have created alone. Randy Savage's legacy survived the banishment and outlasted everyone who enforced it. The grudges were real and the damage was real, but so were the moments. Those moments were genuine. Subscribe so you never miss another great backstage story. Hit the like button if you enjoyed this one. And drop a comment below telling us which conflict surprised you most. Was it the Jarrett extortion? Shane squaring up to Brock Lesnar? The Randy Orton Royal Rumble collapse? Let us know below.
I like to think I'm the only human on earth that's ever taken a right hand for Brock and didn't go night-night. I went 20 more minutes in the match.
I was like, I'm gonna bite his nose off. I'm gonna bite his nose off. Like, I see this big, giant, fat nose, and I'm like, if he comes any closer and takes a swing on me, I'm not even saying it as a tough guy. I'm literally going to bite his nose.
When Chris Jericho stood face to face with Brock Lesnar backstage at SummerSlam, he admitted he was freaking angry, ready to tear into one of the most dangerous men in wrestling history. That rage wasn't unique. Behind the Beast's scary mystique and undeniable star power, multiple respected names quietly hated working with him. Some felt disrespected, others feared for their safety. A few watched their careers get crushed under the weight of his backstage control. This is the hidden story of 8 legends who secretly couldn't stand Brock Lesnar. The scary part is that most of them never had the power to fight back. Brock operated under different rules that nobody else in the locker room could access. He had creative veto power that let him kill storylines on a whim. He could change finishes minutes before showtime without consequences. He could demand opponents get switched out entirely, destroying months of planning. And when someone tried to push back or question his decisions, things got physical fast. The locker room knew it, management knew it, wrestlers whispered about it in hallways and dressing rooms, but almost nobody could stop it because challenging Brock meant risking your own career. If you're enjoying this deep dive into wrestling's darkest backstage secrets, show some hype to the video and let us know you want more stories like this. So let's start with the most recent controversy and work our way back. By the end, you'll see the pattern. Number 8. Matt Riddle thought he could use social media to create his dream match. The rising star kept calling out Brock in interviews, saying he wanted to be the guy who retired the Beast. It was bold. It was confident. It showed the kind of fearless attitude that made Riddle popular with fans who loved his laid-back persona. And Brock absolutely hated it. At the 2020 Royal Rumble, Brock cornered Riddle backstage in what became one of the most intimidating power moves in modern wrestling. Paul Heyman and a security guard were standing right there, watching it happen. Brock grabbed Riddle's shoulder, making sure the kid couldn't move, and delivered a message that killed the dream instantly. He told Riddle to stop saying his name and stop tagging him online because they would never work together, ever. The words were direct. The tone was final. That wasn't just a warning. It was a threat wrapped in absolute certainty. But the damage went even deeper than one backstage confrontation. 2 years later, Riddle was told he was winning the 2022 Royal Rumble. Management had the finish locked in. This was supposed to be his breakout moment, the night he became a main event star. Then Brock lost his WWE Championship to Bobby Lashley earlier that same night. Brock refused to accept a smaller role on the card, so he got himself added to the Rumble match. And according to Riddle, Brock walked in and changed the entire plan. He said he was winning, and nobody in power stood up to him. Not one producer, not one executive. Riddle's career-defining victory got ripped away in seconds because Brock had the leverage to rewrite the show on the fly. That's the kind of control most wrestlers will never have. Number 7. Jinder Mahal was supposed to headline a historic tour of India as WWE champion. Survivor Series 2017 was being promoted as a massive champion versus champion showdown between Jinder and Universal Champion Brock Lesnar. WWE had already started the marketing push overseas, building Jinder as the face of the company's expansion into India. Posters were printed, advertisements were running. Fans in India were excited to see their champion facing the Beast. Then, 2 weeks before the pay-per-view, everything changed in the most brutal way possible. Jinder lost his title to AJ Styles on SmackDown in Manchester. Reports confirmed that the sudden switch happened because Brock refused to work with Jinder. Brock decided Jinder wasn't the right opponent for him, and he demanded the company replace him with AJ Styles instead. The decision was made without Jinder even knowing it was coming. He found out the same day he lost the belt, standing backstage while his championship reign ended without warning. Jinder later tried to soften the story, saying Brock just pitched the change for stylistic reasons. But the damage was already done. Jinder had to go on the India tour without the championship. Even worse, instead of being booked as a dominant hero in his home country, he was forced to lose to a 50-year-old Triple H during the tour. His credibility as a top star was completely destroyed. WWE's entire international marketing strategy got thrown out because Brock didn't like the matchup. That's how much power he had. One conversation and months of planning meant nothing. Number 6. Braun Strowman learns the hard way that Brock doesn't tolerate mistakes. During their feud in 2017 and 2018, Braun was still relatively green, despite his rapid push to the main event. He was improving fast, but he was still learning the subtleties of working with top-level talent. At the 2018 Royal Rumble, during a triple threat match for the Universal Championship, Braun accidentally landed a stiff knee to Brock's temple during a sequence.
It rattled Brock hard. And instead of brushing it off like most veterans would, or waiting to address it after the match, Brock delivered a receipt that crossed every line. He threw a full-force closed-fist punch directly to Braun's skull and told him to slow down. The punch was real. It wasn't worked. It wasn't theatrical. Slow-motion replays captured the terrifying impact, showing Braun's head visibly shift under the force of the blow. Braun somehow finished the match, still competing for another 20 minutes. He later joked that he was probably the only person on Earth who took a right hand from Brock and stayed conscious. But the locker room wasn't laughing. Critics pointed out that Brock's response was completely disproportionate. Given his size, strength, and combat sports background, throwing a real punch at an unsuspecting colleague was dangerous and unprofessional. Number 5. Chris Jericho was watching from the back when Brock crossed a line at SummerSlam 2016. In the main event against Randy Orton, Brock used real elbows to bust Orton open the hard way instead of using safer theatrical methods. The elbows caused a severe concussion and a massive head wound that needed 10 staples to close. Jericho saw the blood pouring and immediately asked the producers and Michael Hayes if the finish was planned. Hayes wouldn't give him a straight answer. Jericho called it out loud, saying the whole thing was nonsense as Brock came through the curtain. That's when Brock turned it physical. He shoves Jericho and hit him with a line that became legendary. He told Jericho to either hit him or kiss him. Jericho didn't back down. He got forehead to forehead with Brock, and later admitted he was ready to bite Brock's nose off if the confrontation escalated. Jericho wasn't playing around. He described the moment on a podcast, saying he was furious about what happened to Orton, and Brock saw that anger and decided to challenge him anyway. While Orton eventually confirmed he had agreed to the risky finish, the altercation exposed a major problem. Brock was willing to inflict real damage to protect his beast mystique, and most people in the back were too scared to call him out. Jericho was one of the few veterans with the credibility and guts to stand up to him, and even then, it almost turned into a backstage brawl. Number 4. Jon Moxley put everything into preparing for WrestleMania 32. The no-holds-barred street fight against Brock was supposed to be his breakout moment as a hardcore wrestling icon. Moxley was at the peak of his popularity, and the build had featured legends like Mick Foley and Terry Funk passing down their signature weapons to him on live television. Moxley spent months drafting creative ideas. He pitched thumbtacks, a barbed wire bat, chainsaw sequences, and even an opener with gimmicked pepper spray to create a believable underdog window before Brock took over. Every pitch was designed to tell a brutal story that would pay off the weekly television buildup. But Brock refused to collaborate. He brushed off every idea Moxley brought to him and wouldn't even rehearse or plan the match until hours before the show. On Steve Austin's podcast, Moxley called Brock lazy and described the frustration of putting in massive effort only to be met with complete apathy. Brock was quietly preparing for his return to UFC later that year, so he prioritized protecting himself physically over making the match memorable. The result was a disappointing 13-minute squash filled with basic chair shots and repetitive suplexes. Instead of a star-making spectacle, the audience got a house show effort. Moxley's momentum was killed, the creative staff's work was wasted, and Brock walked away without a scratch, ready to focus on his UFC payday. That's what happened when full-time talent had to work with a part-time contractor who had zero long-term investment in the company's creative health. Number 3. Shinsuke Nakamura felt disrespected on the biggest stage in Japanese wrestling. In 2006, New Japan Pro Wrestling was in financial crisis, and they signed Brock to a huge contract in a desperate attempt to boost ticket sales. Brock won the IWGP Heavyweight Championship almost immediately and defended it against Nakamura at the Tokyo Dome on January 4th. For Nakamura, it was supposed to be a dream match. Instead, it became a nightmare. Nakamura could sense that Brock had no passion for the performance. The match felt cold and transactional, like Brock was just collecting a paycheck. Nakamura believed Brock was looking down on Japanese people and treating New Japan's hallowed history with contempt. After the match, Nakamura broke down and cried in the locker room. It was the first and only time in his career that he cried after a wrestling match. He admitted that Brock gave him no sense of love for the business. It felt like Brock was just doing a job. The insult didn't stop there. Brock later refused to return to Japan for a scheduled title defense because of payment disputes. He packed the physical IWGP Heavyweight Championship belt in his suitcase, took it back to the United States, and kept it hanging in his garage for over a year. New Japan had to strip him of the title and bring back an old belt design just to keep their main championship alive. Nakamura and the entire Japanese locker room were left humiliated. Brock had treated their most sacred prize like a trophy he won at a county fair. Number 2. Goldberg and Brock checked out at the same time, and the fans made them pay for it. WrestleMania 20 at Madison Square Garden was supposed to be a powerhouse brawl between two legitimate tough guys. Instead, it became one of the most embarrassing matches in wrestling history. Before the show, news leaked that both men were leaving WWE immediately after the event. Goldberg's contract was expiring, and Brock was chasing an NFL career. The New York crowd was furious and rejected both performers from the opening bell. They chanted insults, told them goodbye, and made it clear they weren't getting any respect. Instead of trying to win the crowd back with intensity, both Brock and Goldberg responded with complete apathy. They stood motionless in the ring for the first 4 minutes, refusing to touch each other. The entire match was slow, lifeless, and full of stalling. Goldberg later admitted that once the crowd started booing, there was nothing they could do about it. Brock and Goldberg, two of the highest paid performers in the company, held the audience in contempt and refused to put in professional effort for their final performance. Stone Cold Steve Austin stunned both men at the end of the match, and the crowd cheered loudly because they were celebrating two checked-out stars finally leaving. It was a disgrace. Number 1, Hardcore Holly's career was nearly ended by a botched powerbomb, and then Brock buried the revenge story. In September 2002, on the premiere episode of SmackDown's fall season, Brock attempted a powerbomb on Holly. Due to a mistimed jump, excessive sweat, and a slipped grip, Brock dropped Holly directly on his head and neck. The impact caused cracked vertebrae, pinched nerves, and a ruptured disc. Holly needed immediate surgery and spent over a year recovering. When Holly finally returned in late 2003, WWE tried to turn the real-life injury into a storyline. They booked a revenge feud, leading to a WWE Championship match at the 2004 Royal Rumble. Holly saw it as his chance to finally get a main event spotlight after years of working the mid-card. But Brock was hostile to the entire program. He viewed Holly as a mid-level guy who didn't deserve a championship match on pay-per-view. While both men were warming up backstage, WWE management cut their match time from 15 minutes to just 8 minutes, including entrances. The time got handed to Shawn Michaels and Triple H instead. Holly and Brock were left with a rushed 6.5-minute squash, where Brock won cleanly and sent Holly right back to the mid-card. Holly's big moment was destroyed. Years later, Brock made it even worse by roasting the entire feud in his autobiography. He questioned why he was sent to South Africa to face Holly and said nobody would pay to see the match. Despite all of that, Holly maintained his old-school pride. He said Brock called him in the hospital and checked on him after the injury. Holly made it clear he wasn't scared of Brock because he was comfortable with who he was. So here's the clear pattern. 8 legends, 8 stories, and all share the same themes. Brock operated with creative veto power that let him kill dream matches, rewrite finishes, and reject opponents he didn't want to work with. He prioritized his own safety and outside business interests over collaborative storytelling. He enforced locker room hierarchy with real physical violence instead of earning respect through professionalism. And he treated championships like props that only mattered when it benefited him financially. Some of these men tried to stand up to him. Jericho got in his face and refused to back down. Holly kept his pride intact despite being buried. Nakamura cried, but never forgot the disrespect. But most of them couldn't fight back because Brock had leverage they didn't. Management protected him at all costs. Producers wouldn't challenge him even when they knew he was wrong, and the full-time roster had to watch as one man's ego repeatedly damaged the business they loved and sacrificed for. The scary truth is that this wasn't just about bad chemistry or personal disputes between performers. It was about a broken system that allowed one performer to operate above the rules that everyone else had to follow. When you give someone that much unchecked power, the locker room culture suffers in ways that last for years. Rising stars get their momentum killed. Creative ideas get vetoed. Safety gets compromised. And the collaborative foundation that makes wrestling work starts to crumble. But there's a positive takeaway here. The veterans who stood up to Brock, even when it was dangerous, deserve respect. Jericho didn't back down. Moxley called him out publicly. Holly kept his dignity. They proved that speaking the truth matters, even when the system protects the guy at the top. And fans like you, watching videos like this, help make sure the real stories don't stay buried. The more we understand what happened behind the curtain, the more we can appreciate the performers who put the business first instead of just chasing their own paychecks. So, which story shocked you the most?
Was it Riddle getting his Rumble win stolen? Jericho nearly fighting Brock to the death? Or Nakamura crying after feeling disrespected in Japan? Drop a comment and let us know. And if you want more deep dives into wrestling's hidden controversies, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and we'll keep bringing you the stories nobody else will tell.